And I looked at these things and it didn't look like humans to me. They had 11 different lobes of their brain. Their spinal cord met the brain, had 2 little bulbs in each side, which they could never figure out what they were. It wasn't like ours. These 𝗍𝗓𝗦𝗧𝗘 had just one organ that was made up of the heart and lungs. It was just one organ. When he was taken in to Los Alamos, to a medical facility at Los Alamos, and examined, of course, the physicians didn't know what they were examining. They figured out, they eventually were able to communicate through sign language. In 81, I believe it was 1981, there was a scientist who died, a scientist, Air Force scientist who passed away, and he had an old Army footlocker full of autopsy photographs. And these autopsy photographs were of the creatures that died in the Corona crash. And so we went out to recover all this stuff. And I looked at these things and it didn't look like humans to me. I looked at this and these were actual, you being a doctor, you understand, autopsy photographs. And they were, still photographs of autopsies, but they had the organs out. And I had a little bit of medical knowledge, not a whole lot, but I had a little bit of medical knowledge and looked at this and I said, it doesn't look like a heart or it doesn't look like a lung. But what we found out was, and true, that these 𝗍𝗓𝗦𝗧𝗘 had just one organ that was made up of the heart and lungs. It was just one organ. And they had a couple different stomachs for different digestive reasons. And they had an organ that would take every single bit of moisture out of it, whatever they ate, and fed the body. So they didn't really have to drink a lot of fluids. And when I found all this stuff, I took it in, I immediately classified it. I asked for a briefing. What is this? Is this human or not? Well, on the bottom of each photograph, there was a case number and a date. And the dates were in the 40s, 47. I think there was September something of 47. And the case wasn't a case number that I recognized. So then I asked, and eventually I got a briefing by a scientist who was a medical doctor. He was from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. He came out, and myself and the other agents that were involved in this, he briefed us. He gave us basically anatomy 101 of an extraterrestrial. And he said, yeah, in fact, these are the autopsy photographs from Corona. Yeah, the brain had I don't remember how many lobes the human brains have, but they had 11 different lobes of their brain. And they had, where their spinal cord met the brain, had 2 little bulbs in each side, which they could never figure out what they were. It wasn't like ours. And their eyes were very sophisticated. They had the optic nerves, but the optic nerves went into different places in the brain, almost as if the brain was operating, their eyes were operating at different parts of the brain for some particular reason. Their muscles were extremely fibrous. I remember that, especially the leg muscles. They weren't bulky, but they were strong. They were fibered, which I guess gave them more strength than what our muscles. They didn't have ears, but they had a canal with an organ or gland, I think they call it, a little bulb that they think was what they could hear out of. But they didn't have vocal cords like we had. Their vocal cord, they didn't have any. So this another thing that was brought in the briefing was very fascinating to me. When this creature was found, he couldn't communicate other than hand signals. So when he was taken in to Los Alamos, to a medical facility at Los Alamos, and examined, of course, the physicians didn't know what they were examining. They figured out, they eventually were able to communicate through sign language. And eventually, somehow, somebody figured out how to do an operation on the vocal cord or insert something in there so it could talk. it could make sounds, and I don't know how they did that. Through, I guess, well, I wasn't directly ever briefed on that, but I found out some years later that they did it telepathically. Yes, there was the handler. This the Ibn that lived, the Ibn one. He had an Air Force captain that was assigned to him, and the captain was a linguist, spoke I don't know how many different languages, but he was also an intelligence officer, and he was able to build a really good rapport with the Ibn, and was able to communicate far more communications than anyone else could. And he actually lived with this Ibn for, I think, the 3 or 4 years until it died. A DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, was intimately involved in it. Everything that we sent up everything we sent up to OSI headquarters went to DIA. And there was a guy by the name of Tom Mack. Tom Mack was a project manager in DIA for this project. The projects had various names. And some of the names were just a phonetic name, like Quebec, phonetic alphabet, military phonetical alphabet. The Q, you would say, if you were talking over the radio, Quebec, Q for Quebec. And so we would use phonetic for a particular operation with a district, a number, one of our district numbers, and then a progressive number, we call it, after that. So you might have a Q17, which District 17 was OSI at Kirtland, and then a progressive number for the case number. And but if you went to Pease Air Force Base, I went out to Pease Air Force Base, which is no longer there, but it's in northern New York, is a SAC base, Strategic Air Command Base. They had a very peculiar incident happen up there. Of a UFO that was flying around their nuclear weapon storage area. It actually landed, and a weapon had been taken apart. The warhead wasn't stolen, but somehow it was taken apart, and there wasn't anybody in this bunker to do that. So they figured, how the heck this happened? So they thought maybe it was a Russian operation or something. And so we went up there, and during this briefing, during this operation. We found fingerprints, but they weren't like our fingerprints. They were very strange looking prints. Now, if you remember when I told you about one of the creatures had two hands on one arm, one appendage, it appeared that something like that had gotten in there. Somehow it got in it, and nobody could figure it out because it's a very secure area. Figure nuclear weapon storage is very secure, but they had fingerprints. So now we have fingerprints, and that was the first time that we, as a government, actually got extraterrestrial fingerprints.
Do you remember what year it was?
That was in '84. It was 1984. Yeah, it was winter time, so I don't remember if it was late winter, early winter because it was snow on the ground. Of course, upstate New York, it's pretty bad. But I thought that was fascinating. But we never could figure out anything other than that it got in, and it took fingerprints. Now, there were many, many, many cases of UFOs spotted around nuclear weapons facility, launch control facilities, Ellsworth Air Force Base, Maelstrom Air Force Base, and then SAC bases that had nuclear weapons. Yeah, I read a report where almost virtually everything was, but some of them were more intrusive than just the security forces seeing something flying around compared to creatures found inside an area. And we had that at Kirtland in 1980, where security police at Manzano complex, which was where the nuclear weapons were stored, saw these strange lights out of Coyote Canyon, which was east of the complex, the nuclear weapons complex, and something landed. And so I conducted that investigation, which was extensive investigation, which led into the 𝗪𝗏𝗦𝗬𝗧 incident. Actually, one of the security officers from Sandia Laboratories, they had their own security, was checking, it was driving around on a graveyard shift sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, and saw a craft land at a bunker. But the bunker didn't have anything in it, but the craft landed. And when it landed, all the electronics in that vehicle shut off. His engine shut off, his portable radio stopped transmitting, his portable radio in the vehicle stopped. For as long as that craft was on the ground. When the craft took off, everything came back on. And so I investigated that. All we found was that something landed there.
Was on-base radar?
No radar. I checked it. The first thing I did was checked with FAA. And we had also at Kirtland, we had at that point, at that time, it was pretty a secretive unit that scanned every single frequency that could possibly be generated in and around the base, radio frequencies. And so I went to them and I said, hey, did you guys pick up any strange frequencies on this particular time frame? Nope. I said, okay, I went to FAA. Let me see your printouts for this night. Nothing. So then I thought, well, are these guys making this up or what? Well, then the security police inside Manzano, I interviewed them separately and they told me the exact same story. So I thought it just makes too much sense to be a fantasy or hoaxing. So we investigated, but we could never find anything regarding that craft. But shortly after that, Major Ernie Edwards, who was the commander of the 1608th Security Police Squadron, the security, Air Force security police that guarded Manzano, came to me and said, I got a phone call from a guy by the name of 𝗪𝗏𝗦𝗬𝗧. He lives right outside the base. He lives in Four Hills, which is a housing community just on the other side of the base perimeter. And he told me he's seen all sorts of strange lights around Manzano. So I said, oh, that's strange. And so I started checking into it, and we found out that 𝗪𝗏𝗦𝗬𝗧 owned a business right outside the main gate of Kirtland, Thunder Scientific Laboratories. They made humidity sensors for submarines. So he had a government contract, and he had security clearance. So I went and paid him a visit, asked him about what he saw, and he started telling me all sorts of stories about what he saw and what he did and what he thinks they are. So we conducted an investigation just to make sure this guy wasn't a Russian spy. He wasn't, doing all these things. His house was literally just a few feet from the base perimeter. I mean, his backyard bucked right up to the base perimeter, and he had all this sophisticated. Now he was a physicist. He had all this sophisticated equipment on his patio, his upper bedroom patio, that was pointed towards the base, and that's what we were concerned about. So we conducted an investigation on him, not only us, but National Security Agency, because he actually tapped in, and this was classified at one time, I don't believe it is classified anymore. He was tapped in to a National Security Agency, an NSA project that was going on base, and which he shouldn't have been able to figure it out, but he did. Very smart guy. So we had to figure out how we're going to get him away from what he was doing. And so we started slowly convincing him, or not really convincing him, but just giving him the idea that this might be just UFOs, extraterrestrials. And he ran with that. And I know I had a lot of criticism about that. I fed him all this disinformation and I made him go crazy, but Paul thought a lot of this up on his own. I didn't have to. It wasn't very difficult for me to convince him what he was seeing. He just told me it's UFOs. Years later, I became friends with him. Years later, after I got out, He still owned it. I tried to explain to him that what he saw wasn't, but he would never believe me. He eventually went crazy and he died some years later. But some of what he was seeing was, he took pictures of strange looking lights in orbs. And in fact, I sat, and not just me, Jerry Miller, who was he had been a Project Blue Book investigator some years before, and he was in the intelligence staff at Kirtland, not with OSI, but with another agency. Him and I sat in a room, probably not any bigger than this, with really tall ceilings. And Paul was sitting, and we just had dinner, and we came in and we had some coffee, and the lights were down. In fact, none of the ceiling lights were on. We had just some table lights on. And we were talking. It was 8 or 9 o'clock at night in a winter night. And he was explaining to us what he was seeing. And all of a sudden, we see this orb up in the corner of his room. And I looked at it and I watched it. Nobody else saw it at first. And I kind of elbowed. There was 3 of us there. It was me, Jerry, and another agent by the name of Steve Atzett. And I hit, and Jerry looked up and he said, and we didn't say anything to Paul. And it started flying around the room. And then, of course, Paul saw it. He said, well, there it is. We looked around like, what the heck is this thing, you know? And so we watched it for maybe 20 seconds and it disappeared. And went right back to that spot. Well, Jerry thought that it was created by Paul. And Jerry confronted him. He said, Paul, what did you just do? Paul said, no, I didn't do anything. He said, can I look and can I check things out? Yeah, go ahead. Well, Jerry's a scientist too. He looked all over, went up to his room, couldn't find anything that could have generated something like this. It was a ball of light with like little sparklers around it. And he says, that's the aliens. That's their reconnaissance. That's how they keep an eye on me. And a few weeks later, we were in his house without him being there. Now, a lot of people are saying we broke in, we surreptitious entry. He gave me the key. Paul gave me the key, told me to keep my eye on, if you ever want to go in there, here's the key. So we didn't get any search warrants or anything, but we went in there and we saw a real small orb, not the same size we saw earlier, real small orb that burned a hole through his ceiling. Through his wall, from one room to another. And when we came back a couple of weeks later, we told him about it, and that burn hole was still there. Oh. So at first, we thought Paul was just hallucinating, you know. But the more I looked into this, there was something to this. He was actually photographing extraterrestrials. Not so much of a creature or but of their reconnaissance or their small orbs that they used to conduct experiments on humans. And he had I don't remember how many, but he had a whole group of pictures that I told him, the next time you take any pictures he had a Canon 35 millimeter, one of those, well, at that time it was new. He had a Canon 35 millimeter, and I told him, I said, if you ever take any pictures of UFOs, don't develop them, let us do it. And he said, okay. So he calls me one day, he says, got a whole roll of 32 or 30, whatever many's in one of those rolls of photographs of these UFOs that I took over at the base. So I went out, picked them up, took them over to our secure photo lab, gave them to our secure developer and said, hey, develop these. And I stayed there, watched, wait. I said, I wanted some 3x5s and, 8x10s and whatever you can. So, an hour later, however long it took, he comes out with them. He says, what the hell are these things? And they're oval shaped crafts flying above planes that were landing at, now Kirtland Air Force Base shares a field with Albuquerque International Airport. So planes coming in, these things would fly right over top of them and then veer off. And I can't remember how many photographs there were, but they were structured crafts. And we had them blown up. the photo guys could do a lot. We had them blown up. I mean, whereby these crafts were about as big as the Corona crafts, and they were exactly. Oh, absolutely, details, struts, the bottom of it. Well, there was one particular one, and these were color photographs showing a blue trail coming out of the bottom of the craft, which is probably the energy device. And we sent them all up to headquarters, and I don't know whatever happened to them. Now, he didn't do a video, but we had a video that was brought to us at the base of this guy who lived in Placitas, north of Albuquerque, lived in the mountains. He was retired Air Force. I believe he was a pilot. And he had a video camera setting up, and he was watching animals. He lived in a remote area. Deer and elk would come up to his back area. And he was pretty much filming that. He was a wildlife amateur photographer. But one night, he heard a noise, went out, and this craft hovering right over his backyard. And he took a video of that. It was about 28 seconds or something like that before the craft took off. And that is the only video of a legitimate video. We took the video, the camera, and everything, because you always want to analyze all this stuff together. We sent it to headquarters. They sent him a check back to pay for that camera, because they were going to give him that camera back. And they were going to give him, and he wanted copies of that, but he never got that back. They classified it. OSI headquarters. At that time, it was at Bowling Air Force Base, headquarters at Bowling. We sent it to headquarters IVOE, which is the counterintelligence location, and then they would send it over to NSA. And the only reason I know that was years later, after I retired, I joined a pretty closely knit group of former and retired intelligence officers. And we get together every year. I haven't attended every single year, but out of 25 years, I probably attended 20 of these reunions or get-togethers. And normally, they're after or before the UFO convention at Laughlin. Well, it used to be at Laughlin, now it's in Arizona. And we'd sit down and talk. We just sit down and talk about, in a secure, kind of a semi-secure place, and talk about what we know. And that's why I learned a lot from them, because they were briefed in programs I wasn't briefed into. And one of the intelligence officers was from NSA. And when I first met him in probably 94, 95, and I had never met him before, I didn't know him before, he said, I always wanted to meet you because you and I were on the same case together. I said, what case? He said, Paul Bennewitz. I said, what do you mean, Paul Bennewitz? He says, yeah, we interviewed him too. So they were investigating, and we were investigating, and we didn't know they were investigating. One particular night at Paul Bennewitz's house, it was rainy night, winter, kind of fall. I was there, and Jerry Miller was there, and Paul was showing us different things. And Paul came to me and he said, you see that house across the street? The front of this house. I said, yeah. He said, you see those lights in that upstairs window? I said, yeah. He said, they're not supposed to be there. I said, what do you mean? He said, the house is vacant. I said, I said, I wonder who's over there. So I got a gun, and so I go down and I snoop around, and I see the two vehicles parked hidden in the backyard. One's actually in a yard. So I get the license numbers off these vehicles. And the next, I didn't want to go in. I figured, well, maybe they're buying a house or whatever. So the next day, I ran the plates, and they come back to a rental company out of Hertz, I think it was, out of Denver, and they were rented on a government credit card. So I thought, okay, now go ahead. I don't know, a week or 2 weeks later, we were there at the same time, and we see these lights. Well, these lights are, you can tell, camera lights, the old red lights coming out, seeing that there's cameras pointed over here. I said, I'm going to get them this time. So I call Albuquerque police contacts I had, tell them what I had, and somebody come over there. They come over and we confront these two guys, and they had to tell us they were special agents and they rented this place. That's about all they said. So I knew.
Did they say what agency?
No, they didn't. And APD was, I was off base. I didn't have much jurisdiction there. So Albuquerque Police Department had to, I was relying on them. They ID'd them. It was confirmed that they rented a place. So I was left at that. But this agent I met years later told me, he said, we investigated that one. We investigated the abduction up at Springer. I didn't know this. So NSA was intimately involved in this stuff too. DIA, of course, CIA. We have quite a few members of our group from the CIA. They weren't. They didn't do any field work because the CIA couldn't do that. But they were relying on a lot of information that we were feeding them, and they were doing analytical studies of what they had. But the FBI, of course, was involved in it. They found a box, a cylinder, I should say, not a box, a cylinder on the Eben craft that had been analyzed at various locations, and Sandia had it. And in 1984, President Reagan came to Sandia and was going to be specifically briefed on this. And I happened to be part of the security detail. And I was in the room when they was explaining this to him. And this cylinder they had a electron microscope view of it, or however they figured out how to x-ray it or whatever they did to it. But they had cutouts of it and a presentation on an overhead projector. And they were explaining to the president what they thought these things did. And it was a multi-purpose avionics device that was also a navigation device for them. And so that's really the only technology that I've ever learned or heard that Sandia was involved in.
If you like this video and you want to see more amazing content, go ahead and check out the next video on our channel.